Now on Radio 4, it's time for the first in a new series of Stanza on Stage. Here's Simon Armitage.
We're beginning this new series of Stanza on Stage with a reading by one of Britain's foremost poets, Tony Harrison, recorded at this year's Bath Festival. As well as establishing himself as a hugely respected and influential poet, most notably through a continuing series of sonnets about his parents and his upbringing in Leeds, Tony Harrison has also reached a mass audience through his drama and television work, and more recently by publishing poetry in national newspapers. Before the performance, I asked him how important public readings are to a poet of his standing.
I've always had a mixed feeling about doing readings. It depends a great deal on where I am with my work, whether I'm feeling like being retrospective. And then when I have to read a lot of old poems, I sometimes feel I'm being pulled back into an earlier form of myself, you know, and I sometimes don't like that. I resist it. But then when I've done new work, I like to try it out, you know. And I also think, for me, it was important in trying to find a more direct and accessible way of writing. And it's important for me to see audiences and try and also make new readers, you know, take your works and offer them up.
Amongst your best-known poems are the very personal pieces about your upbringing and your family. Is it difficult to share those with a public audience in that way?
It surprises me how much they still affect me, even though I've read them countless times. But I think one of the uses of form in dealing with, you know, deep feelings of grief and emotion is that it enables you in the end to end up with something you can separate yourself from and give to somebody. And I think that if you've done the poem right, it's shareable.
You've written a great deal now, extensively for television and for theatre. Do you see that as a separate aspect of what you do, or is it all very much part of the same thing?
It's all part of the same thing, you know. They use that expression in America, hyphenate. You know, somebody is a poet hyphen dramatist, or a poet hyphen librettist, or director, or whatever. And I don't agree with the hyphen. You only need one word, and that's poet. But poets, you know, for 2,000 years were the prime movers of theatre, from the Greeks onwards.
So is that about reclaiming something that was lost?
Yes, yeah. And also trying to find, in the television poems, a public role for the poet. You know, I think I felt when I wanted to be a poet as a young man, the range of poetry had shriveled. And I felt that I wanted the whole of my energy and the whole of my life adventure to be hazarded on being a poet, and that meant working as a poet in all the forms that had previously been available and all the new forms that might be available.
More recently, you've written poems in response to certain world events, current affairs. I'm thinking of the Gulf War, and also you've been in Bosnia. Do you see that, in a sense, as a kind of responsibility?
Yes, I think I do, and it's a hard thing to accept it as a responsibility, but I think, first of all, claiming the power over language, and poetry seems to me language at its most powerful, most persuasive, most entertaining, still, there's no other substitute for it. And growing up amongst people who couldn't articulate, I early acquired the idea of the responsible position of using language, the power over language, the responsibility of it. And then you feel that by using language truthfully, you're offering a proper alternative to the euphemisms of collateral damage and so on that were in all the newspapers and on the media.
Is there a comparison there with a war artist, for example?
I think so. I think that's a fairly good parallel. And I'd discussed both with television and with The Guardian whether one could do it at first hand. And I like the idea of doing it, and I like the idea of doing it where the situation was destructive. Because it seemed to me to go where the element was entirely destructive and to offer a creative act and not, be panicked by the situation was, although I'm not sure about the quality of the poetry, I felt that the act of hazarding that creativity was an important one for me to challenge myself with, and I'd go on doing it, I think.
Tony Harrison. And it was with that poem about Bosnia, published in The Guardian, that he began the reading at the Bath Festival.
The Cycles of Donny Vakuf. I should say, when the army goes into areas, they rename the roads with very pretty names, like, in this case, the names of jewels. And it wasn't a very jeweled experience, but the roads were called after jewels. The Cycles of Donny Vakuf. We take Emerald to Bogoino, then the Opal route to Donny Vakuf, where Kalashnikovs still shoot at retreating Serbs or at the sky to drum up the leaden beat of victory. Once more, though this time Serbian homes get pounded to facades like honeycombs. This time it's the Bosnian Muslims' turn to cleanse a taken town, to loot and burn. Donny Vakuf fell last night at 11. Victory is signalled by firing rounds to heaven and for the God to whom their victories owed. We see some victors cycling down the road on bikes that they're too big for. They feel so tall as victors, all conveyances seem small, but one whose knees keep bumping on his chin rides a kid's cycle with a mandolin, also childish size, strapped to the saddle, jogging against him as he tries to pedal. His machine gun and the mandolin impede his furious pedaling and slow down the speed appropriate to victors, huge-limbed and big-booted, and he's defeated by the small bike that he's looted. The luckiest looters come down dragging cattle, 2 and 3 apiece they've won in battle. A goat whose udder seems about to burst squirts out her milk to quench a victor's thirst, which others quenched with shared beer, as a cow who's no idea she's a Muslim's now sprays a triumphal arch of piss across the path of her new happy Bosnian boss. Another struggles with stuffed rucksack, gun and bike, small and red, he knows his kid will like, and he hands me his Kalashnikov to hold, to free his hands. Rain makes it wet and cold. When he's balanced his booty, he makes off for a moment, forgetting his Kalashnikov, which he slings with all his looted load onto his shoulder and trudges down the road where a solitary reaper passes by, scythe on his shoulder, wanting fields to dry, hoping, listening to the thunder, that the day will brighten up enough to cut his hay. And tonight, some small boy will be glad he's got the present of a bike from Soldier Dad, who braved the Serb artillery and fire to bring back a scuffed red bike with one flat tire. And among the thousands fleeing north, another, with all his gladness gutted, with his mother, knowing the nightmare they are cycling in, will miss the music of his mandolin. that idea about the hollowness of the idea of victory was one of the earliest experiences in my life. I think I was 8 when the war ended. And I always remember one of the greatest celebrations I've ever witnessed were in the streets, bonfires and so on. And even as a child, then I had this instinct that this celebratory fire was related to this devastating, all-encompassing, destructive fire that had been unleashed onto the world with the dropping of the first nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I'd always been obsessed with that idea from the age of 8. And last year I also made one of my film poems, which was about the 50th anniversary and the ceremony held in Hiroshima to commemorate it. But I've written a number of poems looking back on those moments in the street. When I go back to Leeds, where I grew up, in the cobbled street outside, there's this vast black circle, which is the VJ bonfire. What was left of it, it's this black circle. And I remember somewhere a dim image that this black circle was like those things I'd seen in atlases of the stars, but the stars had all been wiped out. The idea of extinction entered into my consciousness. These are 2 poems from Sonnets for August 1945 called The Morning After. The fire left to itself might smoulder weeks. Phone cables melt, paint peels from off back gates, kitchen windows crack, the whole street reeks of horsehair blazing. Still it celebrates. Though people weep, their tears dry from the heat, faces flush with flame, beer, sheer relief, and such a sense of celebration in our street. For me, it still means joy, though banked with grief. And that now clouded sense of public joy, with war-worn adults wild in their loud fling, has never come again, since as a boy I saw Leeds people dance and heard them sing. There's still that dark, scorched circle on the road. The morning after, kids like me helped spray hissing upholstery spring wire that still glowed, and cobbles boiling with black gas tar for VJ. The rising sun was blackened on those flames. The jabbering tongues of fire consumed its rays. Hiroshima, Nagasaki were mere names for us small boys who gloried in our blaze. The blood-red ball, first burnt to blackout shreds, took hovering batwing on the bonfire's heat above the Rule Britannias and the bobbing heads of the VJ Okie-Kokie in our street. The kitchen blackout cloth became a cloak for me to play at fiend Count Dracula in. I swirled it near the fire. It filled with smoke. Heinz ketchup dribbled down my vampire's chin. That circle of scorched cobbles, scarred with tars, a night sky globe, nerve-wrackingly all black, both hemispheres entire, but with no stars, an archerless zilch, a scaleless zodiac. Somehow the idea of immortality, eternity, futurity was destroyed by the invention of those weapons, certainly in my consciousness at that time. But I'd got my sense of eternity from the camp coffee bottle. If you know what camp coffee is, that is rather an essence of coffee essence, and the picture on it is a Scottish officer outside his tent somewhere in the Empire, and there's a turbaned Sikh, a Chuprasi, bearing on a silver tray a bottle of camp coffee, on which there is a turban Sikh bearing a bottle of camp coffee, on which there is, and so on. And I got my sense of eternity from staring at this. And suddenly it somehow came to an end. It's called Old Soldiers. Last years of empire, the fifth of war, and camp coffee extract on the kitchen table. The Sikh that served the officer I saw on the label, in the label, in the label, continuously cloned beyond my eyes, beyond the range of any human staring, down to amoeba, atom, neutron size. But the turbaned bearer never lost his bearing, and nothing shook the bottle off his tray. Through all infinity and down to almost zero, he holds out and can't die or fade away, loyal to the breakfasting Scots hero. But since those 2 high summer days, the US dropped the world's first A-bombs on. From that child's forever, what returns my gaze is a last Chuprasi with all essence gone. I'm just about to start rehearsals at the National Theatre, and I went there first in 1973. So it's quite a long 23 years of done about 8 to 10 pieces there. The first piece I ever did, I always remember, and it was then in the Old Vic, a woman saying at the interval, "My dear, he has such a command over language, but they say he comes from Sheffield." And they didn't, they didn't even have the knowledge to get the town right. It's late, but in actual fact, it was absolutely right that where I came from helped make me into a poet. And I wrote a very tiny poem, which is always been a signature tune of mine. It's always in the anthologies, which is called Heredity. How you became a poet's a mystery. Wherever did you get your talent from? I say I had 2 uncles, Joe and Harry. One was a stammerer, the other dumb. I've always been not only obsessed with those kind of things, but obsessed with language and acquiring languages. I grew up in a house with very few proper books in an educated family, and I won a scholarship and started learning Latin and Greek at the age of 11. And I was always aware around me of the struggle with articulation, so that it seemed to me almost like the greatest gift one could acquire was the power over language. But it did create a kind of division, I think, between me and the people I grew up amongst and loved. And oddly enough, when not oddly enough, absolutely right, that when my parents died, I suddenly found myself writing a poetry, although it was based on all the formal restraint I'd been learning as a kind of apprentice to great masters. I looked for a simpler poetry to try and bridge this, not gap now, but an abyss created by the deaths of my parents. And the middle section of the School of Eloquence, which I'm still writing, is about my parents. My mother died before my father. This is a poem on the day she died, when we're still eating the pie she'd baked that day. And, thinking that we should is an experience to make us very, very close, but what is still between us. My mother we had this fire, coal fire with little buffets on either side we used to sit on, both of us rather silent, and my mother always used to call us bookends. Oh, that's what the poem's called, bookends. Baked the day she suddenly dropped dead, we chew it slowly, that last apple pie. Shocked into sleeplessness, you're scared of bed. We never could talk much, and now don't try. You're like bookends, the pair of you, she'd say. Og that great, say nothing, sit, sleep, stare. The scholar, me, you, worn out on poor pay, only our silence made us seem a pair. Not as good for staring in, blue gas, too regular each bud, each yellow spike. A night you need my company to pass, and she not here to tell us we're alike. Your life's all shattered into smithereens. Back in our silences and sullen looks, for all the scotch we drink, what's still between's not the 30 or so years, but books, books, books. There are a lot of poems about fire, domestic hearth, the fires of cremation. And these are two poems about the fires of cremation. Both quite similar in the basic idea, which is that the fire that's needed in cremation to dispose of human remains isn't hot enough to melt gold. And it's about rings. This is although many of these poems are about the gaps and divisions that British life and education created in me and my family and my ambition to be a poet. There are also continuities, and the first collection I published of these sonnets was called Continuous, which referred to the need to keep writing these poems, but also is about the continuous used to have outside the picture house. That there were either two houses at the pictures, or they were continuous. You could sit there all day sometimes, see the film go on and on and on. But it's about the continuity between me and my father, between his father. We used to go to this old cinema in Leeds, and we shared. I'm talking about seeing a film in 1949, a James Cagney film, White Heat. I like James Cagney, my father liked James Cagney. We went to the cinema, and the cinema was an old one and they had an organ where someone comes out and plays and then goes down again. And there used to be an interval when the organist came up. And my treat was getting a chalk ice. My dad used to go get the chalk ice. And usually when just the light went down, these big hands of his with this ring, this thick gold ring, it was like a belt. I see the light glinting and he'd open his hands, I catch the ice cream. And then we saw the film. Continuous. James Cagney was the one of both our streets. His was the only art we ever shared. A gangster film and chalk ice were the treats that showed about as much love as he dared. He'd be my own age now, in 49. The hand that glinted with the ring he wore, his father's, tipped the cold bar into mine, just as the organist dropped through the floor. He's on the platform, lowered out of sight, to organ music, this time on looped tape, into a furnace with a blinding light, where only his father's ring will keep its shape. I wear it now to Cagney's on my own, and sense my father's hands cupped round my treat. They feel as though they've been chilled to the bone from holding my ice cream all through white heat. This is a kind of parallel poem to it, and indeed, for me, it's still a very sad, upsetting poem, but this search for continuity with my parents and so on goes on. I still write poems about them. This is maybe my earliest experience of being in kitchens, a memory of, like, little kid hanging around wanting to help. I was probably 3 or whatever, and my poor old mother having to find things to keep me out of mischief and danger. And what she always came up with, but it always was a good thing, was watching the sand go through the egg timer and telling her when it'd go. And then, of course, you could always turn it over again. And that's why the poem's called Timer. It's almost one of my earliest memories of my mother. Timer. Gold survives the fire that's hot enough to make you ashes in a standard urn. An envelope of coarse official buff contains your wedding ring, which wouldn't burn. Dad told me I had to tell them at St. James's that the ring should go in the incinerator. That eternity inscribed with both their names is his surety that they'd be together later. I signed for the parcel clothing as the son, the cardi, apron, pants, bra, dress. The clerk phoned down. 68831. Has she still a ring on? Slight pause. Yes. It's on my warm palm now, your burnished ring. I feel your ashes, head, arms, breasts, womb, legs, sift through its circle slowly. Like that thing you used to let me watch to time the eggs. I'll finish there.
Tony Harrison recorded at the Bath Festival of Literature. Stanza on Stage was introduced by Simon Armitage and produced in Bristol by Rob Kesridge.